I am Lara Burns, head of terrorism research at George Washington University's program on extremism. Here, continuing to tell the history of the Hamas terrorist organization, both in the United States and abroad, based on real facts, in an effort to provide truthful insights that hopefully cut through just the blankets of false information and terroristic rhetoric that are spreading through our country right now. With me today is Senior Fellow Jennifer Baker. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for having me back. So when we ended our last episode, we mentioned that the PLO and Israel had begun to consider a compromise to the end of the first Intifada.
Yes. But you know what? Before we get to that, I think it's important for us to talk about an event that occurred in early 1993. After those March al-Zahor deportations of Hamas leaders and members, along with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders and members, we talked about that last time. There was an event that occurred just after that deportation that is important to talk about before we get to the issues.
What was that event?
Okay, so in February of 1993, the New York Times published an article about the Israeli arrest of an Arab American man out of Chicago. His name was Mohammed Abdel Hamid Salah, and he was arrested along another man from Chicago named Mohammed Jomah Hilmi Jarrad. And the article reported that Israeli officials learned that Mohammed Salah had traveled to Israel to build a military structure for Hamas in light of the deportation of so many of the Hamas members and leaders, right? He was there to kind of try to help them rebuild. The article described Mohammed Salah's confession to the Israelis, which, I mean, he later said that the confession was coerced, but in that confession, he allegedly said he had delivered $130,000 to the West Bank and Gaza, and most of that was for weapons purchases and the construction of Hamas safe houses in the West Bank and Gaza. But that on a prior trip to the area, he had actually gone to help plan attacks against Israelis. So in that article, it stated that Mohammed Salah admitted that Hamas had drawn very critical support and in both the forms of political support and military guidance from agents who were in the United States. And he also, or according to the article, identified that the Holy Land Foundation was a cover for Hamas funding, and that the United Association for Studies and Research was a political command center for Hamas in the United States.
But before we go any further, can you explain the meaning behind Marzouk's, aka Abu Omar? What does that mean?
Oh, yeah, very good question. So, in Arab culture, men often have a nickname, for lack of a better term, and it is usually the word Abu and then the name of their oldest son. Abu in Arabic means father of. So Abu Omar would be father of Omar. And in this instance, Musa Abu Marzouk's Abu name is Abu Omar, and Omar is Marzouk's oldest son. So back to the article, the New York Times reported that they contacted Ahmed Yusuf of the UASR, who was on the Palestinian Committee chart that we've talked about multiple times. And he denied any affiliation with Hamas and claimed he did not know Mohammed Salah. And he admitted that Musa Abu Marzouk had been on the board of the UASR, but he claimed that he had resigned. So this article is important because it exposed for the first time in American public media that the UASR and the HLF were Hamas friends. And the arrest and confession of Mohammed Salah would later lead to his own designation as a terrorist here in the United States. But we'll talk more about that later when we get to that time period.
Okay. But at that time, the U.S. had not designated Hamas as a terrorist organization. Is that right?
That is correct. So at the time we're talking about now, 1993, Hamas had not been designated as a terrorist organization yet. However, the Middle East peace process was extremely important to the United States government and the President Clinton's administration at the time. There was a heavy focus on what was going on between Israel and the Palestinians, and how that struggle was impacting the broader Middle East peace process. So at the time, Yasser Arafat was the face of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister for the government of Israel. Hamas leaders outside the Palestinian territories at the time were, of course, Musa Abu Marzouk, whom we've talked about, and Khalid Mashal. We've also talked about him briefly. And leaders inside the territories for Hamas were Ahmed Yassin, whom we've seen, Mahmoud Zahar, Abdelaziz Rantisi, Ibrahim al-Yazuri, and a few others. And as we previously talked about, Hamas opposes peace with Israel. And at this time in 1993, that was not different. Hamas was opposed to peace. And on September 13th, 1993, a ceremony was held on the White House lawn with President Clinton overseeing this ceremony, where Yasser Arafat, on behalf of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Yitzhak Rabin, on behalf of the government of Israel, signed what is known as the Oslo Accords. Those are also referred to as the peace accords. And what those accords were supposed to do was pave a roadmap to peace between Israel and the Palestinian population, to pave a roadmap toward a two-state solution so that the Palestinians could have their own state, and to pave the way for Palestinian self-rule, which were all positive developments in the region. But Hamas was not happy. As we know, Hamas opposes peace and compromise with Israel, and the Hamas leadership decided that they would derail the Oslo Accords and undermine Arafat as the leader of the Palestinian people. They were not happy about it, and they vowed they were going to defeat what was happening. While they were vowing to defeat this, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, for the most part, were celebrating. They were happy about this chance for hope, this chance for self-rule, and a possible two-state solution. Interestingly, on September 13th, the very day of the White House ceremony, Abdel Halim Ashfar, that we've talked about before, who uses the nickname Abu Hassan, and Shukri Abu Baker of the HLF, and Omar Ahmad, also known as Omar Yahya of the IAP, had a phone call to discuss what was happening and to discuss the need to have an urgent meeting among the leaders of the Hamas infrastructure in the United States to discuss how they were going to proceed in light of the accords. On this phone call, they discussed who should attend, who should present papers, how many papers should be presented, and the various topics that should be discussed at this meeting relating to the media and charitable organizations, the HLF, the IAP. But on this call, they worried over the implications of the Palestinian self-rule, including whether or not the Palestinian Authority would shut them down. The executive director of the HLF, Shukri Abu Baker, worried about speaking publicly like he had in the past, because he feared he would be exposed as a Hamas supporter, and that the HLF would be exposed as a Hamas front organization. In that call, Ashkar suggested that Mohammed Hilmi be invited to attend. And that is the man that was arrested with Mohammed Salah, according to that 1993 New York Times article, arrested by the Israelis. And Shukri Abu Baker did not think that would be a good idea. He was really worried about if someone were to walk into their meeting off the street, if they realized who Mohammed Hilmi Jarrad was, then it could expose them as being part of Hamas. And so he was very concerned about that. So Shukri Abu Bakr, Ashkar, and Omar Ahmad agreed that the meeting would take place on the weekend of October 2nd in Philadelphia.
And did it actually take place in Philadelphia?
Yes, it did. And the FBI was listening.
The Philadelphia meeting is crucial. It happens at a very specific time, a time in which the leadership of Hamas knows that things are changing, both in the Middle East and the United States. So they are meeting. This is a rare meeting of the entire leadership of Hamas in the U.S. coming together to decide the strategy at a crucial and very dangerous moment for them. This is unique. What is also unique is the fact that the whole meeting was wiretapped. We rarely have insights into something like this when people come together. This is a very security-minded organization. They are very secretive. They know how to talk. Obviously, in this case, they didn't. They were not security-minded. This is a unique window into the thinking, the processes, the structures inside, even how meetings took place inside the Brotherhood and Hamas. This is not something that we know very well, and the Philadelphia meeting is unique in providing that window into the group.
Not everyone who was part of the U.S.-based infrastructure, or not even everyone that was invited, could attend. For example, Ahmed Yusuf of the UASR, we talked about him. He was interviewed in that article from the New York Times. Had health with family issues and was not present, but a number of these members of these organizations did in fact attend. And there's a chart that shows who the attendees were and the evidence that the government collected showing how they established their presence or involvement in the meeting. There were also some surveillance photos of some of the attendees that we've seen.
Interesting. So when they did arrive, did they talk about what they wanted to accomplish in this meeting?
Yes, they did. And the primary goal that they had was, like Hamas, to derail the Oslo Accords. And they vowed to do it. And they also vowed to undermine the Palestinian self-rule. You know, they acknowledged in this meeting that they supported Hamas, that they supported jihad, which is, you know, the holy war, the violent fighting and struggle. They agreed that Hamas would likely be considered a terrorist organization by the United States. And as a result of that agreement, that they needed to open new organizations in the event their organizations were closed. They also agreed they needed to lie to the American public while remaining true to their goals and ideology when speaking to the Palestinian community. They identified, you know, which of the front organizations were part of Hamas in Gaza and which were part of Hamas in the West Bank and who they were going to support. It was a lot.
That is a lot to digest. Are you able to break that down into various points so we could discuss the individually?
Yes, I think that's very important. It was, you know, the meeting spanned, I think, the first to the third. A lot of issues were discussed. The theme was derail the Accords, undermine Arafat as the ruler. But we'll go one by one as far as, you know, the topics that were discussed. And let's talk about how it was called to order. So Omar Ahmad, who was a leader of the IEP at the time, and then also was standing in as leader of the Palestinian Committee for Marzouk, because Marzouk was out of the country on Hamas business. So Omar Ahmad called the meeting to order and stated, quote, "This meeting was called for by the Palestinian Committee in order to have a seminar or a meeting to the brothers to present here today in order to study the situation in light of the latest developments on the Palestinian arena and its effects and impacts on our work here in America," end quote. One of the attendees, Abdel Salam, noted he had been in the Palestinian territories for several weeks leading into the signing of the Oslo Accords and then the follow-on Philadelphia meeting. What may come as a surprise to those listening here with us is that the attendees acknowledged that people in Gaza and the West Bank were happy about the signing of the Oslo Accords. They were happy about the chance for hope. They were happy that the government of Israel was going to withdraw or had withdrawn from Gaza. And Abdel Salam said, quote, "I came back the day before yesterday. I was there for 5 weeks. I mean, I was there before and after the agreement. What you notice is that even before the agreement, one would walk into the Gaza sector and would feel that it is truly autonomous without a need for anything. People there have self-rule," end quote. Now, this should have made people who were pro-Palestinian, very happy, but not this group in attendance. Abdel Salam went on to say that people could now raise their Palestinian flags and that in the West Bank, quote, "People are very happy and are posting flags outside and stuff," end quote. And then Abdel Salam lamented, quote, "You don't feel that there's anything called intifada or something. Markets are full, people buy and sell, there are no curfews on the street," end quote.
Whenever it was in September 93, there was a sense of, you know, here's hope. And there was a sense of, maybe we can move ahead, and then remember that Oslo, the interim agreement, what's called the Gaza Strip Jericho interim agreement that was signed in May of '94 in Cairo, called for the establishment of a Palestinian state in 5 years. I mean, great. When we left, when the IDF withdrew, to the best of my recollection, I was in one of the last cars to leave Gaza, and I remember even Palestinians throwing like olives at us. I mean, there was a sense of, of move ahead, something optimistic. I even remember who I was in the car with. And as we were driving, I think there were he and I for sure. Maybe there was a third person in the car driving from the base out. And I think we were thinking to ourselves, not to make light of this, right? Are they going to throw grapes at us, right? Are they going to throw something else at us? And there was this sense of, wow, they are like out in the street. I don't know if I would use the word celebrating, but maybe the right word would be hopeful. And I remember, like, I'm literally one of the last to leave. And there was, maybe a sense of a little bit of the unknown, where is all this going? But also a sense that I think from their perspective, and them, the Gazans, that largely the occupation is over, and the Palestinian Authority will come in and will create a new Gaza.
That's fascinating that these attendees at the Philadelphia meeting, they seem to be upset that these people are happy and they're filled with hope.
Yes. But Hamas was opposed to the Accords. Hamas is opposed to peace with Israel. And they opposed Yasser Arafat as a leader of the Palestinian people. So they were angry about all of it. And individuals at this meeting, they dreaded potential success of these peace agreements, seemingly at the expense of the happiness of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. At one point, Shukri Abu Bakr, Ghassan Dadouli, and Ghassan Alashi talked about how bad it would be if the Palestinian state was successful.
I don't recognize the name Ghassan Dadouli. I think this is the first time we've spoken about him.
You're right. So he was a member of the Palestine Committee. He was involved with the IAP. We've not talked about him, but he, in addition to being part of this Hamas infrastructure, he was also an associate of Osama bin Laden's, one of his associates named Wadi al-Hajj, who has been convicted of terrorism here in the United States. He was one of his associates, and Dadouli was actually deported from the United States in November of 2001. But so he was part of this original infrastructure. And if we go back to the text, when they're talking about how terrible it would be if the Palestinian state was successful, Ghassan Dadouli said, quote, "Let's suppose, God forbid, the state started and things quieted down and the self-rule started. And then this group of allegedly pro-Palestinians said, God forbid, God forbid." And Dadouli's whole point in this would be, well, the IAP wouldn't be important to anyone anymore. Interestingly, Shukri Abu Bakr, again, who was the executive director of the so-called terror organization, the HLF, was the most worried of all of the attendees that they were going to be exposed as Hamas. He insisted that at this meeting they refer to Hamas in a code word, Sama. And if you see it on paper, it's just Hamas spelled backwards. So this very unsophisticated code they attempted to use in this meeting, but they were very unsuccessful about it. And so we'll see some excerpts of where they failed with their use of the term Sama as code for Hamas. But Shukri Abu Bakr of the HLF was very worried that they were going to be exposed in this meeting, very security-minded. As the meeting participants joked about using Sama as code for Hamas, Omar Ahmad, again, leader of the IAP and leader at the time of the Palestine Committee, asked, "What is the goal from the war?" This is a quote. "Isn't it the liberation of Palestine? Come on, how are you going to liberate Palestine?" And another member of the group exclaimed, "Through jihad," which, as we know, is violence, not peace. The overall goal of the meeting was to determine how to defeat the Oslo Accords, and how to do that from the U.S. without being exposed. So they affirmed their commitment to derailing the agreement throughout the meeting. But they also wondered if they had the ability to actually succeed in doing that. Ashfar, who we've talked about a number of times, said, quote, "It should be very explicit that the goal is to derail the agreement. But do we have the ability to derail it? That is another question," end quote.
So in this meeting, when discussing how they were going to derail it, what methods were they going to use?
So it was a multifaceted approach that they talked about using, all aligned with Hamas's ultimate goal, right? But interestingly, throughout this 2-day meeting, they combine and the discussions of how they were going to commit jihad and support the resistance and the use of military operations, while also discussing the use of charitable fronts and the media and the propaganda mechanisms. And, really there was a multifaceted approach that involved everything from violence to charity, very much like what you would expect in an organization like Hamas. But the ultimate goal was to destroy the state of Israel and replace it with an Islamist state. So when speaking about making the Accords fail, members acknowledged that the HLF and IAP could no longer overtly support, quote, the resistance in America, and that they could not, quote, include this kind of stuff officially in our papers, end quote. But they had to support the jihad, and this is another quote, support the jihad, support the jihad, support the jihad. And that is a reference to violent fighting. Omar Ahmad made a point that, quote, "We provide services to these people by sending money, spreading their news, and this and that." Shukri Abu Baker of the HLF agreed that their organization had to supply the needs of the movement. And that is Hamas in the fields of journalism, law, politics, investment, and education. So during the meeting, the HLF's executive director, Shukri Abu Baker, acknowledged the need to use the media and how before Oslo, they could report in their media, their papers, quote, "Our brave heroes have conducted this and that operation and killed X number of Jews and Zionists," and stuff like that, end quote. So that is the executive director of an ostensible charitable organization saying that their news used to report on the killing of Jews.
So this is a copy of the IAP newspaper where they do just that?
Yeah, so the IAP had two newspapers. They had Il Philistine and Al Zaytonia. And this is an article from Al Zaytonia in 1991 discussing an operation where 5 Jews were killed, just as an example.
And this is a charitable organization, and they're talking about the killings of Jewish people. That does not sound very charitable to me.
Right? No, it doesn't sound charitable at all. Back to the Philadelphia meeting, Shukri Abu Baker at one point posed a question about what exactly they could do to support Hamas in the United States and said, quote, "What do we want from the reader of Al Zaytonia?" And again, that's one of IAP's newspapers. And I think it's important because, again, it shows the overlap between all of these facets of this organization. He says, quote, speaking of the readers of Al Zaytonia, "Do I want him to go fight, or do I want him to earn his loyalty so that he could donate to me, or do I want him to have a knowledgeable political culture?" End quote. And that's very interesting to me because it is, the mix of violence, charity, donations, and spreading their propaganda. Participants continued to discuss the overlap between jihad and media to support Hamas. And there was a quote here, "The most important thing we can provide in this state is to support the jihad in Palestine. I believe it is the only way if we want to bring the goals of the accord to fail. You have the issue of sponsoring the families of martyrs. You have the prisoners. I believe that there must be more emphasis on these people than others. Those people have a direct relationship with jihad, and they must get more money and more thought," end quote.
Laura, I believe that we saw something about the support for prisoners and martyrs in the last episode. in the request from Gaza-based Islamic Relief Committee. So was that something Hamas and the HLF and IAP was focused on?
Yes, absolutely. We did see that. You're right. In the last episode, in those communications from the Islamic Relief Committee. And we see it in the IAP's Il Philistine and Al Zaytonia magazines alongside solicitations for money by the HLF.
Okay, so they want to support the jihad, give money to those who were involved, and spread the messaging in the media. What other areas were they focusing on in this meeting?
Education. They recognized that a key part of their propaganda mission was to educate people in their community, particularly the children, to educate them on their extremist, radical, anti-Semitic ideology. And this applied to schools in the West Bank and Gaza, but also their intent to do it in schools here in the United States. They discussed that to make people and students aware of their messaging, quote, this will be done at universities and the school levels, end quote. And the speaker went on to say, quote, as for the young people's level, an educational material ought to be prepared to be taught in Islamic curricula. We don't want the children of the community who are raised here in schools and in Islamic schools and non-Islamic schools to grow up surrendering to the issue of peace with the Jews. And I mean, we don't see in 10 years the growing generations in America surrendering to peace with Jews. Therefore, there must be a curricula and teaching materials which spread in Islamic schools and weekend schools, end quote. That's what they want to teach the children. Further, Omar Ahmad, again, of the IAP, talked about educating the educators because they needed teachers who could teach their radical ideology to the students. And they really wanted to strengthen, or Omar Ahmad wanted to strengthen the Islamist influence in American universities and reduce what they saw as Jewish influence in these universities. He said it was a catastrophe that people who join the U.S. government come out of these universities where there is little Islamist influence.
Are we going to talk some more in later episodes about some specific examples of radicalization by Hamas in these schools?
Yes, we will. We will, because it's a very important part of their strategy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's go back to the meeting. Did they express any understanding that they may be considered terrorists in this meeting?
Yes, they did. They suspected Hamas would be designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. government sooner or later, and they knew that they risked exposure. They were even aware that the topic about Hamas's designation was already being discussed in Congress, and they talked about it. And on that note, they briefly mentioned the arrest of Mohammed Salah. The person who was arrested and gave the confession that we talked about at the beginning of this episode. They talk about that he is an example of merely being an American passport holder won't protect you from scrutiny if you're involved in these types of activities. And then they noted, quote, now that the agreement is in place, you are prevented from, your actions are now terrorism and not a resistance, end quote. So they're actually acknowledging that their actions are terrorism. They even compared themselves to Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, who is known as the Blind Sheikh. Shukri Abu Bakr and Omar Ahmad talked about his arrest for terrorism, and they said he didn't commit any crimes.
Wasn't Omar Abdul Rahman arrested in 1993 for the first World Trade Center bombing conspiracy? That was him, correct?
Yes, that's the same person who was ultimately convicted in that conspiracy, and also for conspiracy to murder the Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak and other terrorist plots that he was involved with on behalf of the terrorist organization, an Egyptian terrorist organization named Gamma Islamiyah.
And that's fascinating to me, and they're all comparing themselves to him.
Yes, but they wouldn't say that outside their circle. A theme throughout the meeting was ensuring that they were deceiving the American public about their true agenda and their identity with Hamas. At one point, Shukri Abu Bakr of the HLF and Omar Ahmad of the IAP discussed how they've always sought the destruction of Israel, just as Hamas did in the Charter. But the meeting participants said, quote, "But we don't say that publicly. You cannot say it publicly in front of the Americans. No, we didn't say that to the Americans," end quote. So going back to the convicted terrorist Omar Abdul Rahman, when discussing what they could not say to the Americans, one participant referred to some public quotes that Omar Abdul Rahman had made before his arrest. Like, quote, "I won't be naive to the point of telling the American it is my right to enslave your daughter." And like what Omar Abdul Rahman did in Detroit and said, quote, "America will be a blunder for us," end quote. And then they noted that his words were correct, and the group laughed.
So it seems pretty evident that lying was to the Americans was part of their plan.
Yes. And no one said it more powerfully than the executive director of the Holy Land Foundation, Shukri Abu Bakr, a so-called charitable organization, the leader of it, when he said, quote, "I swear by your God that war is deception. War is deception. Deceive, camouflage, pretend that you're leaving while you're walking that way. Deceive your enemy," end quote. To which Omar Ahmad responded with a basketball analogy, like fake like you're going one way and then go the other. In another related discussion, Shukri Abu Bakr said, quote, "The Americans have no business in our internal affairs, no business," end quote. And the Nahad Awad of the IAP agreed he would address an American differently than he would address the family of a Palestinian martyr. And the Nahad Awad also agreed that, quote, "peace shouldn't be endless," end quote.
So, Laura, we've talked a lot about their support to Hamas, their desire to defeat peace, and their determination to lie to the American public. But what solutions did they actually propose?
Well, they agreed that they were going to act under the cover of charity, under the cover of humanitarian rights, under the cover of humanitarian issues, under the cover of free speech, but that they needed to create a new organization in the event that they were actually exposed. But Omar Ahmad cautioned that they did not have enough people in their closed circle to operate a new organization. There's only so many of them here in the United States. And that they didn't want to expose the people who were hidden, meaning, you have your people who are working with these organizations openly, like Omar Ahmad and Shukri Abu Bakr, and then you have your clandestine operatives that no one knows about. And he was saying that they didn't want to expose the clandestine people, and there are not enough of the overt people to run a new organization. But at this point in the discussion, they said, let's postpone this point until after Nahad Awad gives a presentation on the political and media address and how it should be for the American people. So they put it on the shelf for a minute. And then later, Omar Ahmad and Nahad Awad talked about their plans, and Omar noted that forming a lobby organization would enhance their strength and give them the ability to put pressure on others to adhere to their opinions. So they wanted a lobbying group to pressure others to come around to their ideology. So Shukri Abu Bakr reiterated the idea of forming an organization that could protect their existing ones in the event that they got exposed as Hamas.
So did they actually agree on some goals as a result of this forum?
Yes, they had a number of goals that they agreed upon, and they prepared a summary document dated the last day of the meeting, October 3rd, 1993. And that document was located in a search warrant of a business called Infocom, which was located in Richardson, Texas, across the street from the HLF. Notably, it was run by Ghassan Alashi, who was also a leader in the HLF. It was a related company. And we'll talk about that search warrant later, not to confuse the issue, but this summary document was located in a sister business to the HLF years later. And it noted, kind of what they decided upon. And one of the goals that they had established was to build a political and public relations bureau in Washington, D.C., to present their point of view to the political and media organizations of the Americans, to coordinate political alliances, and to expand the circle of their followers, basically, using the proper means.
So did they actually establish a political and public relations bureau in D.C.?
Yes, they did. The chart before the Philadelphia meeting showed the organizations that were part of the Palestine Committee, and that's the IAP, the HLF, UASR. And then fast forward to, a few months after this Philadelphia meeting where they made this agreement, here is a July 1994 meeting notes from the Palestine Committee, and this is what it looked like.
So is that the Council on American and Islamic Relations run by Niwad Hawad?
Yes, it is. The Council on American-Islamic Relations, CAIR, brands itself as a Muslim civil rights and advocacy group, and it is located in Washington, D.C. It was officially created by IAP leaders Omar Ahmad and Nihad Awad and another IAP leader, Rafiq Jabber, after this Palestinian Committee meeting in Philadelphia. And then a couple of months after this meeting agenda notes here that we're looking at, they were legally created by Omar Ahmad and Nihad Awad. CAIR claims to oppose bias and discrimination, claims to be a civil rights organization. But if you look at the agenda of that 1994 meeting where CAIR first appeared, you see something much different. Let's look at it. In this document regarding the HLF, Charitable Front, IAP, Propaganda Front, UASR, Political Front, and CAIR, from the time period when CAIR was created, it was obvious this group opposed peace, as discussed in the Philadelphia meeting, and that they advocated against peace with the Jews. They were angry that Arab countries were normalizing relations with the government of Israel. This is a quote: "The Islamic and Arabic world is being overrun by a vigorous campaign to normalize the relations between the Muslims and Arabs from one side and the Zionist entity from another side." I'll pause there in the quote. What they're saying, what the Zionist entity they're referring to is the country of Israel. Back to the quote. "Hardly a day passes without us hearing that some Arab or Muslim country has established diplomatic or commercial relations with the Zionist entity," end quote. They go on to state, and this is another quote, "The Jews' objective from these meetings is clear. It is the approval of the peace process by the Muslims and the recognition of Israel," end quote. They aren't complaining in there that the Jews or Israel is trying to kill the Palestinians or trying to deceive the Palestinians in this peace accord. They're complaining that the Jews want Muslims to accept peace. And they worry about the day that they are, and look at this quote, "the only ones who are extremists and radical," end quote. It's very telling right there. They themselves knew at that point that they were extremists and radical, and acknowledge it there in those notes. And that is the premise upon which Nihad Awad and Omar Ahmad and the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure created the Council on American-Islamic Relations, CAIR, an organization Nihad Awad still runs, and one that holds itself out as a civil rights organization. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. We'll continue our discussion.
Thank you.